And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker and our first guest this evening, a dear friend of mine, I'm happy to say, Jenny Kendler. And to introduce her, I'm going to read her very illustrious biography. Jenny Kendler is an interdisciplinary artist, naturalist, and environmental activist whose work asks us to decenter the human, making space for the transformative otherness of our biodiverse Earth. Over the last 15 years, her work on the climate crisis and biodiversity loss has been shown nationally and internationally, including at Storm King Art Center, the MCA Chicago, the Eden Project, the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, the Albright Knox, the California Academy of Sciences, the Chicago Biennial, and the Coaching Missouri Biennale. She has created public art projects for locations from urban conservatories to remote deserts to tropical forests. Alongside an interdisciplinary team centered at Gallery 400 in Chicago, she was awarded an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant for her community-engaged project Garden for a Changing Climate. Since 2014, Jenny has been the first artist in residence with environmental nonprofit NRDC and is currently working with them to develop a public art project for New York City's Governor's Island in 2022. She is a member of artist collective Deep Time Chicago and has been a direct action organizer for Extinction Rebellion Chicago. She is also board co-chair of artist residency Acre and the first artist to be invited onto the board of international climate change organization 350.org. Her work has been covered by the New Yorker, NPR, Audubon Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, Hyperallergic Art in America, and the New York Times. In addition to her solo project at the MSU Broad Art Museum, her work is currently on view at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History, the Lamier Sculpture Park in St. Louis, the Dom Museum in Vienna, nonprofit Chicago Gallery Weinberg Newton, and Oakland Gallery Round Weather, which raises funds for climate justice. So I hope you all will join me in welcoming Jenny Kendler in a little round of applause.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I'm so very, very pleased to be here with you all tonight on what is in Chicago, a very gray and actually beautifully rainy evening. I can hear the rain pitter-patting on the windows. I'm just so phenomenally grateful for all of the deep thought and attention that Stephen has brought to the development of this exhibition, which is the work in the exhibition has been developed over the course of a few years at this point, and the exhibition itself was over a year in the making, partly because of the pandemic, which caused its delay. But we're still really happy to be able to bring it to the public and especially to be able to be here with you tonight. And I think that we're going to start by sharing a video that we have of the exhibition, which we understand Zoom is sometimes a little choppy for people. It's not too long, it's just a little over 3 minutes. And so bear with us and I'll talk you through just in case it jumps around a bit. But it's the best way to get a sense of what the exhibition is like in a virtual space. So here we are entering into the Artist Project Gallery at the MSU Broad, which again, I'm so grateful that they were hosting the exhibition. And also, especially want to thank the preparator team who worked so hard to install this when I actually wasn't able to be in the gallery. This is the first piece that you encounter in the space. It's a boombox covered in shells, and it's called Shelled Game. Forget Me Not is the subtitle, which you'll see on the back. I'll also be talking through these works in a longer format during my slide presentation, so we won't have to be rushed and we'll be able to talk about them a little further. But you can hear a little bit of the audio that'll be playing from that piece in the gallery. This is then the second project that you encounter, which is called the Amber Archive, and what you're looking at is created amber, each of which houses a tiny piece of a biological material from a species that may be threatened or endangered by human activities on planet Earth. So there's snake skin, there are fragments of whale baleen, there are insects. All of these are ethically sourced, so they either were vintage specimens, some of them I worked with a biologist to gather. This is the third piece in the exhibition, which is called Whale Bells. You're looking at hand-blown glass bells. This piece of all of them in the show is actually a collaborative project with the artist Andrew Bernot, who is a dear friend and also a very talented glass blower, as you can see. Each of these ombre glass bells encases in the center a Miocene epoch whale earbone fossil. And so the part of the whale's ear that once was perceiving sound is now creating sound. And these bells are actually what you're hearing in the background of the video. And they are able to be activated by staff at the museum when people come into the museum. The fourth piece is here down on the floor. We're getting a nice close-up view. It's called Shroud for an Atheist. And it's a little complicated, so I'll explain it in more detail as we go through the slides. But what you're looking at basically is a silken shroud, which has a pattern on it that's created based on this textile cone snail, which has this extraordinary and mathematical pattern on it. And these snails happen to also be highly venomous. And so this piece is intended to suggest a burial mound. This is the fifth and final piece in the exhibition. It is a necklace that's created out of hackberry seeds. It's called Heirloom and was sort of one of the central thinking pieces of the exhibition that led us to have this kind of core concept of heirlooms and archives, and thinking about value and heritability and what we want to pass on to the next generation. This piece in particular is interesting because these hackberry seeds also have the same chemical constituency as opal, hydrated amorphous silicone. And so while they appear to be humble seeds in some way, they also are gemstones. And I want us to take a minute to think about why we might value a gemstone over a seed and whether or not we can potentially reverse that dynamic. So of course, we'd love to share the exhibition with you in person, but if you're not able to make it, we hope the video is a reasonable simulacra, and we'll also share a longer version of it, I think, on the MSU website and my website as we get that all finished and developed. So thanks for listening to that. And I'm also going to share some slides with you as our wonderful behind the scenes helper, Christian, gets them pulled up. Thank you for your help, Christian. It's very stress relieving for me to not have to manage the presentation too. So when we're ready, we can go to that presentation. And what I'll essentially do is walk you through some previous work quickly to give you some context for the work in the show. And then I'll talk about the pieces in the show a little bit more in depth. And as Stephen said, then after that, we will hear from Elizabeth about her work at NRDC and have some questions and answers that we've prepared for each other. So this is the first piece that I wanted to share with you. I'm doing just a very brief survey of my past work. This is called Birds Watching. And what you're looking at here is a 40-foot sculpture that's composed of a reflective film mounted on aluminum on a steel frame. This is at Storm King, which is in the Hudson Valley, and was commissioned for an exhibition called Indicators Artists on Climate Change. It shows the eyes of 100 birds that are either threatened or endangered by climate change, and used this tremendous study that was done by the Audubon Society that showed many, many hundreds of birds that will become endangered because of climate change. So this is, I'm forgetting the exact number now, but it's around 300 and something, 314. And so this is showing 100 of them. Next slide, please. And the idea with the piece is to think about how we are sort of implicated by this gaze. Of course, the title Birds Watching is a reversal of what the traditional relationship is, where we would expect to be watching the natural world. I really want us to think in this case that the natural world returns our gaze, that when we look at nature, nature looks back. Next slide, please. And so this project was not only at Storm King, but as with most of my other projects, I want to consider the full life cycle of the piece. And so we were able to use some grant money from the Chicago Parks District to bring the piece here to Chicago, where it's on the 606. It also was recreated in a site-specific version with birds from the European Union in the EU for the Eden project. Next slide. This is another project that also centers around birds. It's called Tell It to the Birds, and this was one of the first big projects that I did in collaboration with Elizabeth. In this case, it was for NRDC's booth at Expo Chicago, an art fair that brings about 40,000 people to Chicago's Navy Pier each year. And we were really trying to create a provocative space where people could have an intimate encounter with an artwork and what otherwise is this very corporate commercial art fair. And of course, what NRDC does is really different and really creates a different dynamic in the space, presenting an advocacy angle centered around environmental concerns. Next slide. So when you enter into this space, what you see and smell is this lichen-scented dish. Hidden in the center is a microphone. And we presented our viewers here with a field guide of 11 different birds that were all endangered for different reasons, and asked people to choose one that they felt a commonality with. They were then prompted to confess something, to tell a secret. And the secret was picked up by the microphone in the center of this dish. And using some custom audio software, it was transliterated into the voice of that endangered bird that they themselves had chosen. And so it was this catharsis where people were allowed to speak this like very secret thing, but everyone would hear it, but no one would really understand what they said except for the person. And here I was really interested in this kind of poetic slippage between the human and non-human worlds, and how that's maybe the first step to any kind of true boundary crossing between the human and non-human. Next slide, please. This is a project called Sculpture Garden. These are Venus de Milos that are made entirely of soil and seeds. We place one of these every month for a year throughout the Chicago Park District in naturalized areas. And of course, next slide, as we would go through the year, they would weather, decay, next slide, grow mold, and eventually transform back into self-sustaining prairie gardens. So it was a comment on thinking about the human body, how we all return to the earth, and also thinking about how we as artists, next slide please, perhaps can't actually make something that's more beautiful than what the natural world provides for. Next slide. I think this is the last of the 4 prior projects I'm going to go through. This is called the Underground Library. And this project, I collected a library of books on climate change for a year. Next slide. And then I biochar them. And biochar is, so essentially really it was a book burning. Biocharring is a process that uses pyrolization, which is a low oxygen burning process that retains all of the carbon in whatever material it is that you are charring, and creates a molecular form that becomes tremendously stable, allowing it to be sequestered in the earth for generations to come. Next slide, please. So I was thinking about trying to honor the words of these people who had written books. That was one of the main ways that we as humans try to change culture, and had issued for decades and decades at this point, you know, going back to Limits to Growth in 1972, these clarion calls asking people to listen to the message that climate change is real, it's here, it's happening now. And their words were not heeded. And so I was thinking of how to return use value to these volumes. And that was through biocharring them and then burying these tiny little bricks of carbon in the earth, sequestering that carbon for potentially tens of thousands of years. Next slide. Excuse me. This is the work on display at Storm King Art Center as part of that same exhibition. Next slide, please. So then this is the exhibition at the MSU Broad, which is, Stephen mentioned, called The Long Goodbye. That, of course, is, for those of you who are noir fans, there's a little bit of an Easter egg here, which is that it's the title of a Raymond Chandler novel, although that's not really the reason that the show is called this. What I'm thinking of in this case is this process of saying goodbye to part of the natural world, to species, to habitats, to ecoregions, to languages, to peoples that are going to be lost irrevocably because of the forces of extractive capitalism, which have led to global climate change. So we need to think how to mourn these losses. I think that perhaps I feel tasked as an artist to try to conceive of new forms of mourning, new types of memorials, new heirlooms that we can pass on. I think that we have many rituals within diverse human cultures which help us to mourn, but we don't really have developed practices to mourn on this scale and to mourn the non-human, to mourn the loss of songs, to mourn the loss of species. And so I think in this show, I'm trying to make some small gestures towards that. Next slide, please. So the central piece in the exhibition, pardon me if you can hear my neighbor above us, I live in a loft building. The central piece in the exhibition is called Amber Archive, as I mentioned in the video. And like I said, what you're looking at is created amber. So these are, they're made with tree resin, the same way that actual amber is created. I started to think about these projects at, say, the University of San Diego has a zoo. They have what they call the Frozen Zoo. That's an archive of genetic material of threatened species that perhaps in some far future, when we both have the technology to de-extinct species and also the we've created the kind of space and ethical framework to be able to do this, that these species could essentially be brought back from dead, undoing some of the harm that we have done in this era. So that, of course, though they exist in these very, very high-tech laboratories, and were there to be some sort of massive power grid failure, which I think several years ago might have seemed slightly less likely, and now coming out of just seeing this happen in Houston and understanding that how fragile our grids are, how fragile our entire technological society is, it becomes much more plausible to imagine that these reserves could be lost. And so I wanted to come up with a much more humble, ancient, and analog way of preserving biological material. And that's what the archive attempts to do. So this is just around, I believe, 130 specimens. I'm in the process of applying for a fellowship at the Smithsonian to attempt to continue this work, but the goal would be that it becomes an expanding archive preserving the biological material of these species for perpetuity. You'll notice a lot of my work is also thinking about this kind of deep time aspect. So either works that are intended to last for millennia or perhaps to biodegrade and disappear in a very short period of time. Next slide, please. I think I wasn't going through the slides fast enough. So you'll see some more views of these. We can just maybe flip through the rest of them pretty quickly, Christian, please. These are some bird feathers. That's whale baleen. This is a piece of shed elephant seal skin. This is a prairie rattlesnake that was collected by a biologist friend. Again, all sheds. So no creatures were harmed during the making of this piece, as you would imagine. This is a stag beetle, and then this is whale bells. So also, I know I have to go quite quickly, so I'm going to really welcome questions in the Q&A period. So whale bells, this is the project that I was talking about that uses the whale ear bones. They're called tympanic bullae, very nice name. Which would be part of the interior ear bones of these ancient rorqual whales from between 5 and 20 million years ago. And with this project, I was really thinking about, or Andrew and I were thinking about these kind of silent seas that these creatures would once have inhabited. So when these whales swam in the oceans, they were the most culturally sophisticated creatures on planet Earth. They had language, I believe, and they had culture. They passed this culture on to their children. And I think about this as a kind of like oceanic palimpsest. So thinking about this sound as it's created, the knocking of this ear bone against the glass as a message in some ways to today's whales, who of course their modern relatives are the humpbacks, who, as we all know, were practically driven to extinction in the 1890s because of hunting for whale oil, which was in some ways the precursor to today's fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So you can see inside, in the case of, that was a previous commission of the work, which exists now on an icebreaker vessel run by National Geographic. These are the ones that are in the exhibition now. Next slide. And that knotting that you see is it's a technique called knotless netting, and it's what you would find around fishing buoys. And so we really wanted to find a textile form that echoed the nautical nature of the piece. Next slide. We actually are working on a collaboration with a musicologist and experimental musician that Stephen has put us in touch with at the MSU, who will be creating an experimental composition on the bells, using them as sort of one giant instrument. And I'm really excited to work with her. That will be sometime in May, maybe May 17th. Maybe Stephen can remind us of the exact date in the chat. But that'll be the next live program as part of this exhibition. Next slide. How am I doing on time? A few minutes. So then this is the piece that I told you is called Shell Game, parentheticals, Forget Me Not. This is a vintage boombox, which of course is something that those of us who are of a certain age may remember fondly as perhaps, you know, something that was one of our fonder possessions. I definitely have a clear memory of dubbing Led Zeppelin tapes on boombox with my brother that we borrowed from our friend down the street. And so, you know, this becomes a very sentimental object. And what this is here is using this type of shellcraft that references a practice from the 1800s that was called sailors' valentines, which were elaborate shell artworks that were sent back by sailors to loved ones after they had been at sea for a long time. And actually the message "Forget Me Not" is a direct quote from quite a number of these sailors' valentines. And so this is a valentine or love letter to the ocean, thinking about ocean acidification, which for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the process of, as we emit carbon dioxide through the burning of fossil fuels, the ocean actually is absorbing the vast bulk of this. It's really doing a great service to us as human beings, but it of course is, thank you, Christian, for advancing. It's actually also causing the oceans to acidify, which for organisms such as corals, echinoderms, mollusks, like you see here, that create shells that are based on calcium carbonate, it actually is going at some point to start to seriously impact their ability to live by disallowing them from being able to make their shells. And so the sound that you heard, that sort of sizzling, hissing at the beginning, it was my own attempt to sort of think about how to create a experiential sound of what ocean acidification might be. And it is created by dissolving one of my baby teeth in hydrochloric acid and contact miking it. That was a tooth that my mother, who was on this call, saved for me. Thank you. Next slide. So this piece is called Heirloom, Hackberry necklace for Hope Yaren, who is a science writer, someone who I really admire, and a person who I think does a tremendous job of translating science and advocacy for a general audience. As I was reading her memoir, which is called Lab Girl, I really recommend it. I learned this fabulous fact that really inspired me, which is that as she was doing, I believe, one of her sort of like first breakthrough experiments, she discovered the composition of these hackberry seeds, which is a common, it's Celtis occidentalis. It's a common street tree, at least in Chicago, and of course is a really important tree. It creates a lot of biomass for non-human animals in forests, but it has the same chemical composition as opal. And so this was a very interesting and provocative thought for me to sort of imagine that I think of seeds as gemstones. I think of them as things to keep in our pocket as treasures and to pass on to our children. Of course, we also have this term heirloom seed. You've all eaten heirloom tomatoes. And I thought about kind of collapsing this definition of the heirloom necklace, you know, perhaps made out of diamonds or precious stones like opals, with these heirloom seeds, and trying to think about why we might value one over the other. So one, of course, being extracted, we could say ripped from the earth, sometimes in these very destructive ways, usually using labor practices that are really exploitative, sometimes child labor. And the other being something that's so generative and so necessary. And so I think part of what I'm really interested in is how to kind of reconceive of what we value in our society. Next slide, please. And you can see a little bit more of that in detail here. I used the type of patterning from Victorian mourning colors here, MOURNING. So also another reference to kind of like to loss, to mourning, to funerary customs. Next slide. And you can see the kind of beautifully corrugated surface of the seeds here. Next slide. Okay, hopefully I'm going to come in right at our mark. So this is the final piece in the exhibition. You find it on the floor at the very back. The idea is that you sort of come across it. It's supposed to be a little bit of a surprise in the back corner of the exhibition. It is a silken shroud that is in the correct proportions to cover an average sized human body. It is a digital print that I created by scanning, well, I photographed actually and insanely meticulously collaged together the pattern from this beautiful shell. It's a cone snail. There's many species of cone snails. This one happens to have a fabulous Latin and common name. It's called Conus textile, or textile cone, sometimes called cloth of gold cone. And of course, as you maybe are picking up from previous works, you know, the names of things can be really inspiring and interesting to me. And so I thought immediately I have to make a textile with this. And as I began to research the snail, I learned not only is it venomous, it's highly venomous, has been responsible for the death of a number of human beings, but it also has this amazing pattern on it that bears a striking resemblance to the kind of mathematical algorithms that are referred to as sorry, they're called, oh, I'm forgetting the name because I'm talking to a computer. Let's see, so sorry, they're sort of like mathematical algorithm that shows this generative form that repeats in a way that Conway's Game of Life. Thank you. Cellular Automata. Thank you, Stephen. Well, I wouldn't be able to get through this much talking without forgetting one thing. So thanks for bearing with me. So Cellular Automata, it's a proof that sort of is able to show that a complex form, especially a very complex and beautiful form in this case, can arise without a designer. So that is where the name of the piece comes from. The idea of Shroud for an Atheist, thinking about who might be in this burial mound. We can go to the next slide. And what it might be that they were researching or interested in. In this case, the suggestion is that this is essentially a proof for evolution, that we can say that we know that beauty can arise without the need for a designer in this case. And so that's the title of the piece. And I think we're at the end of the presentation, or very close. So thank you for listening. Welcome all of your questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth.
I'm going to jump in first just to say thank you to you, Jenny, for that fantastic presentation. Obviously, we've spent quite a lot of time together over the past year and a half, or perhaps longer. But it's always such a pleasure to listen to you talk and talk about your work. And I just want to thank you for sharing with us this evening. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Elizabeth Corr, who's going to share some of her work with us. Elizabeth Corr is the Director of Art Partnerships at NRDC, an international environmental nonprofit organization with over 3 million members and online activists. She was the first in her family to attend college, where she studied contemporary art, politics, and social change. She harnessed that knowledge to create a visionary curatorial position at NRDC, pioneering an innovative platform for thoughtful and sustained collaboration between artists and environmental leaders. Elizabeth's work curating public art exhibitions and programming has increased public interest in and awareness of environmental issues facing communities. Her work has been featured in publications such as The New Yorker, Earther, and PRI, and funded by organizations such as the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Public Concern Foundation, and the Pulitzer Foundation for the Arts. She was a nominee for the Pritzker Emerging Environmental Genius Award in 2018. Thank you, Elizabeth, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. Really, really happy to be here with everyone virtually. And thank you for the introduction, Stephen. So we started with art with Jenny, and now we're going to segue a little bit into some science and advocacy. But as Stephen mentioned, I work at NRDC, where I have a very unique title that's different from most of my colleagues. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about what we do as an organization, how we work, and why a non-arts science advocacy organization is working with artists like Jenny. Next slide, please. So Stephen mentioned briefly, we're 51 years old now, which is a really long time for an organization. And we have over 3 million members and online activists, 700 lawyers working for us. And the way I would describe our work is we're a public interest law firm. We are working to make sure that the communities that you live in are safe, healthy, and vibrant. We're a bipartisan organization, meaning we will sue anybody to protect your interests and your communities. We don't take any corporate support, and that's really important because it keeps us totally unbiased in our work and true to our values. So during this 50-year-old history, we've really become known for our legal fortitude. During the Trump administration, you may have heard the stat, we as NRDC sued the administration over 100 times. I think it's closer to 130. And we've been successful in over 95% of those cases that have been decided. Next slide. This is what we used to look like in the 70s. Next slide. Now I'm really happy to say we look a lot different. We're bigger, we have an international footprint, which makes us more effective dealing with some of these issues. Next slide. And our work is focused on 4 main areas. So climate and energy, nature, people and communities, and international. But really the thread that sort of connects all 4 of these areas together is equity and justice. And that's something we're thinking about as we work in all of these areas. Next slide. So as I mentioned, how we work. Again, the tools of litigation, science, and advocacy. But one of the newer, and I'd say really within the last sort of 15 years, has been partnerships, thinking about who it is we're partnering with, who it is we're working with. And before I came to NRDC, these partnerships had been really limited to the business community, the faith community, the political community. But as an organization, we really kind of overlooked the humanities as an ally in the fight against climate change, and that includes artists. Next slide. So while we wait to switch, I'll just say, I came to NRDC with a background in interdisciplinary studies. And so I really sort of know no other way to think about the world or how to solve problems other than bringing different sorts of people together. So when I came to NRDC, I sort of thought about how could we be communicating our work differently to diversify the environmental movement and also to inspire more people to care about the work that NRDC is doing. You can probably imagine that legal briefs and white papers are not always the most sort of interesting way to talk to folks. So I'm going to talk today about our art partnerships in particular. We work with artists, museums, different cities and municipalities, but I want to spend most of my time talking about our Artist in Residence program with the amazing Jenny Kendler. Next slide. Next slide. I'll start by saying that NRDC was the first large-scale environmental organization to establish an Artist in Residence program, which is amazing. You know, it's hard to sort of start something new at an organization that's so old and established, but because of our persistence, Jenny and I were really able to convince all of these lawyers and advocates that there was a role for artists to play in supporting their work. So the first issue that I want to talk about to help make that connection clear is pollinators, including monarchs and bees. This continues to be a key area of work for NRDC. It relates to biodiversity, pesticides, farm workers' rights. We can go to the next slide. This is a map. Sorry, I'm coming from the science side, so we're going to get some graphs first before we get into art. But this is showing the trajectory of the annual migration from monarchs. And you'll see that the Midwest is really a key area where this is happening. Next slide. As monarchs are migrating, they need to eat and they need a place to sort of lay their caterpillars, and they're dependent on milkweed to do that. But what's happening across the Midwest is this food source, which is vital to the survival of monarchs, is being decimated. Next slide. And that's by pesticides, which are being used across the country in agriculture. Next slide. You'll see the effect that this is having on the monarch population. This is showing us up until 2014. There's been some rebounding, but not nearly what needs to be just yet. Next slide. So NRDC was working, we were suing the EPA over pesticide use and regulation. And that was great. We really needed to do that. But what we also needed to do was to sort of garner public support for this issue and help people understand that there was a role that they could play in actually making an impact on creating healthy pollinator habitats. So this is one of the first issues that Jenny helped us tackle. She spent her time at the beginning at NRDC with our nature team, where she learned about this issue, and she came up with this amazing project, which debuted at the Pulitzer Art Foundation, called Milkweed Dispersal Balloons. You can go to the next slide. I still laugh every time I see this picture, because as you can see, as you can tell already from Jenny's work, there is a lot of humor and sort of tongue-in-cheekness that comes into play here. But this is a food cart that she created for monarch butterflies. So she understood that we need more milkweed in communities for the species to survive. So she created this milk cart that traveled across the Midwest, dispensing biodegradable balloons to people. They were asked to then take those balloons home, pop them in their communities, and release this tenacious seed, which would thereby provide critical habitat for monarchs migrating through the region. This is an amazing place to debut the project in St. Louis, because as you might know, it is the headquarters of Monsanto. So we were really trying to sort of have a targeted advocacy focus on this company that's creating the pesticide that is killing monarchs and milkweed. Next slide. This is another great picture. So one thing I love about Jenny's work is that it can sort of play in a variety of venues. So this is outside of the Pulitzer Art Museum. Next slide. At the same time, we're really focused on how can we use the project to educate people about the issue and educate them in a way that's going to inspire them to take action. So each people who came received one of these handouts, which also sort of served as kind of like a bookmark where they could take it and then learn how they could plant the seeds, what the issue was, and what they could do about it. Next slide. This project, again, debuted at a museum and an art space, but then moved to the farmer's market, which was really surprising for people to see. We were the only non-human food cart on display at the St. Louis Farmers Market. So there we were able to reach a totally different audience on this issue, folks who maybe wouldn't consider themselves connected to the art world, but still very interested in the environment or learning more about it. I want to say right before we go to the next slide that this is the first project we ever did with Jenny, and there was a lot of uncertainty over how it was going to go, what would happen if we worked with an artist. And I want to just pause here to say that one of the really incredible and unexpected outcomes of this project was people would read about it and they'd learn about the issue and they tried to think, well, what could they do in their own personal world to address it? And one of the people who came across this project was the mayor of Aurora, Illinois. He also happened to sit on the board of the Illinois Toll Road Authority. And he learned about this project and realized that the Illinois Toll Road had a practice of mowing all of the native habitat on the side of highways. And this project inspired him to change that practice throughout Illinois. So I call that out because I want to showcase that there are sometimes unexpected advocacy benefits that can happen from these collaborations with artists like Jenny, and you just don't know where they're going to come from. So in addition to individuals sort of having the opportunity to get engaged on this issue, this actually made real change throughout the state of Illinois. Next slide. Next slide, we'll talk about elephants and poaching. So this was another topic that Jenny helped us tackle, the illegal trade of ivory. And this was a big topic for us during the Obama administration. We wanted to close the loophole that was allowing the import of elephant trophies and interstate trade. Next slide, released this report that we were really excited about, showing that California actually had the most illegal ivory trade in the country. And we needed a way to sort of talk about this, talk about what it meant, and talk about sort of what it meant for elephants in general. Next slide. So Jenny came up with this incredible project called Music for Elephants. And to create this work, she partnered with NRDC's wildlife team and our coalition friends to get access to data on poaching and on the birth rates of new elephants. And what she did was extrapolate that data and translate it algorithmically to create this beautiful score. Next slide. Which played on a vintage ivory keyed player piano. Next slide. This was a 10-minute score that was sort of eerie and meditative, and it counted down month by month from the current population of elephants, how long it would take for this population to become extinct if poaching continued at the same rate. Next slide. Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I'm going to talk about this one really quickly. Next slide. This connects to the project that Jenny debuted at Storm King. So in 2018, this was the 101-year anniversary of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is our country's oldest environmental law. And it's about protecting birds who sort of don't have borders. Birds don't understand borders. This critical law made it illegal to kill or injure birds. It's responsible for protecting over 1,000 species, including the sandhill crane from extinction. And the Trump administration worked really hard to weaken this law as an attempt to sort of help out industry. Next slide. Let's see. Oh, yeah. And so what we did, we worked with Jenny to sort of leverage this project to showcase what was at stake with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, why it was so important. And one way to do that was to use the project to create a really, really robust schedule of public programming that could help educate people about the issue. And so we brought together this really diverse group of collaborators, musicians, writers, falconers, to come to Storm King with us and to use Jenny's piece as a launching point to talk about climate change, habitat loss, and the threats that both are posing to birds. Like, you'll see, Jenny, what bird is that? You'll know in the picture in the center. as Jenny mentioned, this project continues to live on in Chicago. And I'm also happy to report that just last week, the Biden administration, thanks to persistent legal work by NRDC, has moved to restore those protections that Trump tried to weaken in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and go one step further to strengthen the law moving forward. So we're really excited about that. Next slide. One last picture showing how beautiful the reflectiveness of the sculpture is. I think Jenny might have mentioned this, but one thing that I loved about this was sort of feeling as if nature was looking back at you and really asking us sort of, what are we going to do? Are we just going to stand by and not take action? Next slide. Next slide. So I'm going to talk really quickly, just sort of scale out from some of the projects that we did with Jenny as our artist in residence, which, you know, we're so happy to still have her and still be working on projects that are even going into 2022 at this point. But another project I want to talk about is directly related to climate change, particularly a byproduct of the oil refining industry called petcoke. This was a really, really important case that we were working on in Chicago on the southeast side, which is this incredible neighborhood in the 10th ward, where it has some of the most biodiverse land in the city, but at the same time, some of the most industry. And those two things are sort of butting up against each other constantly. And what we learned from community activists is that piles and piles, you'll see in this top picture, of black soot, a very fine dust, was piling up in the neighborhood and blowing around and getting all over people's homes and in the schools. And this was a carcinogen, a known carcinogen, in fact, with no laws in effect as to how to store it. And so the community reached out to NRDC and asked us to sort of help petition the city to actually enact laws on how to store this safely. But no one could understand what it was we were talking about. And so we needed a way to show them what was happening in Chicago so that the community would see the injustice in it and help rise up to support what we were asking for. So we recruited 13 artists in collaboration with the Museum of Contemporary Photography. So again, a non-arts organization that's doing science work, works with the museum, and we bring in 12 artists and we pair them all up with community activists, so people who live in this neighborhood and who have been doing this work on the ground for years. And we came up with an exhibition that ran for a year, 6 months in the museum and then 6 months in the community. And we used it as a rallying cry to pressure the city, but also really showcase how this one community in Chicago's 10th ward was experiencing something that's happening across the country over and over and over again, where pollutants are coming in diverse communities. They're bearing the burden of environmental pollution and no one's helping them. So this image you'll see on the top of the black dust, Senator Durbin actually used this on the Senate floor when he argued against the Keystone XL expansion. And so I love this project because it shows what you can do when you bring these diverse sets of people together, how you can really make change, and how art can be instrumental in actually advancing advocacy. Next slide. I might be getting close to time. Next slide. So in addition to visual art, another way in which NRDC is expanding how we think about our work is the written word and collaborations with writers. So we did a project with the San Francisco-based publisher, McSweeney's, issue 58, 2040 AD. This came out December 3rd, 2020. And it's the first ever McSweeney's issue to go to a second pressing and then to a third pressing, which is amazing. But the stories in this issue were all inspired by the IPCC report about climate change and the impacts of climate change that we were going to be seeing across the world. So each of these writers, which McSweeney's brought to NRDC, were paired up with an NRDC science or advocacy buddy. And they worked together for 6 months together, sort of understanding each other's craft and work. And each of those authors sort of honed in on something from the report that spoke to them, and then crafted a fictional story about that. And, you know, this issue, you can go to the next slide. It's global, it's intergenerational in how it thinks about climate change. It's multilingual. And I think it's really sort of like showcasing how NRDC's work and work on climate in general can expand, you know, not just far beyond the visual arts to include the written word. The whole book as well was illustrated by a very, very talented artist who helped bring these stories to life. Next slide. Next slide. So the last thing I want to talk about is one more iteration, and not the final iteration, but just another example of how we can work with museums or cultural institutions. So sometimes we'll work with an artist to use a piece of their work as a launching point to talk about other environmental issues. So at the Whitney, we brought together leaders in the field of water safety to talk about health, EJ, and community activism in Flint and Newark. So many of you probably know NRDC was the group that led the lawsuit in Flint, which we won after years and years of litigation to get the lead pipes in the city replaced and to make sure that people are no longer drinking poisoned water. But it wasn't just Flint or Newark. In the last 5 years, over 5 million people have been drinking water from systems that violate EPA's lead limit. And there's 10 million pipes in the ground still across the country that are made of lead. So this is a huge, huge national issue still. But we were invited to the Whitney to use this piece by the artist Pope L, this exhibition called Choir. What you're seeing is this huge multi-thousand container of water, which came from Flint, Michigan. It's being pumped throughout the room, and there's microphones placed throughout the room. So you're hearing this amplified sound of the water moving. It's all coming, it's hard to see, from an upside down water fountain at the very top. So what Popel is doing is sort of drawing the connection between the Jim Crow South to the current water crisis and how this sort of environmental injustice persists to this day. Our lead lawyer spoke on the stage of the Whitney Museum with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who is a pediatrician in Flint, Michigan, who first raised the alarm about the issue with lead in Flint's drinking water because all the children coming in to see her had lead poisoning. And then Yvette Jordan, who is a Newark school teacher and resident, who is really, and to this day, still leading the fight against the lead pipes in Newark schools. So one of my favorite ways to work, I think this is a really, really effective way to talk about these issues and to motivate the public to get involved.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was incredible. So inspiring. And of course, Dr. Mona is affiliated with Michigan State University. So there's also definitely a direct connection there. And I mean, all the projects are really amazing. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your work with us. I am going to move quickly into a little bit of a conversational period, but I hope those of you that can stay with us, we would love for you to stay and continue to listen a little bit longer and hopefully also engage directly with us, probably about 10-15 minutes or so. And I guess to kick it off, I want to go back to a topic that you brought up, Jenny, that certainly also applies to your work, Elizabeth, and I think it also kind of seemed to have sparked a little bit of interest in the chat as well, but it really has to do with this notion of value and this effort to kind of reorient and reconsider the things that we hold valuable, dear for ourselves and our societies and our cultures. And I guess, Jenny, you spoke a little bit to this, but I would love to hear you kind of expound a little bit further. what does that actually look like in the cultural sphere? What role does art play in that process? Of course, art also has its own kind of relationship to value, without being overly leading. I would think that materials and process and things like that kind of play into some consideration here, but let's talk a little bit more value.
This is a big question, so I think I'll start somewhere and then maybe we can bounce back and forth a little. But I think that a lot of what I think about as an artist, and an artist specifically who is really interested and engaged in being an agent of cultural change, is that we as human beings are so caught in the web of narrative. It governs how we choose our political leaders. It governs how we choose our paths in life, what kind of work we want to do. It governs the types of worlds that we can imagine. And, the narrative that we've all been enrolled in, sort of without even seeing it as a story or maybe even as a myth, is this one of extractive capitalism and this myth of unending growth. And I think that we start to see, we've referenced during this talk a little bit already, this kind of like moment in the 70s where there were these shifts in consciousness. And I think particularly in this case of the famous photograph of the blue marble. So looking back at the planet Earth and how it really, for the first time, had this visual impact to show people that we live in a closed system. And so I think about how that we as artists, part of our role is to kind of to re-story or to make new narratives, because we can't imagine we can't create cultural change if we don't have the ability to imagine this new place that we're getting to. And so in particular, this narrative that I would like to start to change is this one of value, to move away from thinking about value as residing in capital, as residing in these like, tangible things that we sort of store capital in, potentially, gold, diamond, gems, Bitcoin, contemporary art, that they become these vehicles for, like high levels of capital and fungible trading. And to think about where real value lies in our world, this tremendous biodiversity, the tremendous generosity, the abundance of planet Earth that provides really everything that we need, except that this one system of value is starting to erase the ability of this other system to actually do even its most basic functions.
Maybe, Elizabeth, if you're game, I can kind of rope you into this too a little bit. Just thinking about kind of another question that I had, but you also spoke to the same idea, because it's a question that constantly kind of, is bouncing around my head, is, like how does art work? Like work in terms of being a verb. How does art affect change? How does art influence our lives or affect us emotionally, psychologically, physically, whatever it may be? How does art work? And in the context of this conversation, I mean, you've actually presented a number of several instances in which, the relation or the collaborations, the partnerships that you've embarked on, like actually produce significant moments of cultural, social, potentially political change, or at least some form of maybe an awakening, if you can call it that. Maybe that's a little bit hyperbolic, but still there seems to be a recognition of some sort. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the potential of art to be this kind of agent of change, and also maybe how that also kind of ties into kind of reorientation of values to some degree.
Yeah. So art is a verb. I love that. I think that one of the beautiful things about working with artists like Jenny, but also just more generally, is that what they're pushing you to do is to think about things in new ways. And in order to get you to do that, they're creating this sort of emotive experience that you get to have with a work of art. And you can see in the gallery space with Jenny's exhibit at MSU that there's this delicacy to the way in which she's working. There's this magic, and from those sorts of encounters, you start to ask yourself questions. How can I be involved? How can I change what I'm doing? But you also start thinking about the world in a much sort of bigger and interconnected way. I think that what I like about the work that NRDC is doing with artists, and why I think it's actually effective, is because art doesn't tell people what to do or tell them how to feel. It's a catalyst for getting you to think differently or think in a new way or see in a new way. And so, as everyone knows with climate change, it's not effective to tell people always how and what they need to do or not do. That's not how you sort of bring more people into the conversation. And art is a tool that sort of helps to work against that. So in all of the years that we've been doing these kinds of collaborations, we've met thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but we're meeting them on their terms. They're coming to us for an experience, an immersive experience often. And not one time during those years have we ever met someone who has said to us, like, I don't believe in climate change. Climate change isn't real. And that's incredible. But the artwork and the work that artists like Jenny are producing sort of disarms people and sort of shifts the way in which they start to think about these issues. And that's what allows for, I think, not only the change in which we think, but the change in how we act in this world. Can I ask you a question, Stephen?
You may.
So one of the things that really interests me about your position in this exhibit is I feel some synergies in your background, but you're at a research institution, and you can tell with the way you're thinking about this exhibit that you are coming at it sort of across disciplines. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how being a curator at a research-based institution like MSU influences how you think about curating art and bringing together exhibits.
So I can say a couple of things. I'll start by saying, one of the reasons that I went into this field, why I went into the arts field, was because in working in the field of art, I didn't have to give up any of my other interests. And so then, dropping me into a context of, this incredible research university, and has, every single kind of disciplinary knowledge you could ever imagine. I mean, it's like, it's an incredibly stimulating environment, and it also allows me that any artist I'm engaging with, that I'm interested in talking to, these relationships are constantly developing. There's inevitably someone on campus that whose expertise or knowledge is relevant or otherwise could be brought into the fold and engage with us, and also hopefully find some level of kind of a reciprocal kind of mutual interest and understanding through the work that we do together. And so, I mean, inevitably, almost every single project that we do has some component of that. I mean, even before an exhibition or a project is kind of more formally conceived or proposed, we're thinking about those threads of connectivity as they relate to disciplines, especially the fields that exist very prominently on campus. One might say also the kind of like the DNA of the institution, and certainly environmental consciousness and awareness is one of those things. Of course, the university has deep agricultural roots, but along with that takes a great interest in awareness of the environment more broadly. And so I find it to be an incredibly rich environment to work in. There's something else I was going to say that now I forgot.
Cellular Automata.
Cellular Automata. Oh, I remember now. So, being in this, heavily research-oriented institution, one of the goals that I have had as a curator is to bring in artists like Jenny that are operating at the same, like, Jenny's research, while it may not look like typical forms of research or kind of, what otherwise is like standardly kind of accepted or otherwise produced through research, operates at the same scholarly level and certainly intellectual integrity as any other scholar at the university. And so, in my opinion, there's kind of maybe a lack of awareness or recognition that many artists, I would argue, are operating at that level. And while, again, the work that they produce, whether it be the Amber Archive or this beautiful heirloom necklace, the research that goes into that and the level of, again, kind of material. I mean, there's it's like material science. It's it's bringing together all this interdisciplinary knowledge. Is important for me to kind of elevate and really present in a way that I hope kind of communicates the level of intellectual rigor that's embedded within these different projects and these objects and things of that sort. And I think this context is an important place in which to have that conversation.
I appreciate that so much, the recognition of the research embedded in Jenny's work, because I think that one of the things early on that I had to do when I was trying to convince a bunch of lawyers why an artist like Jenny should come work with us was they had sort of no idea how artists work. And she was sort of like a mysterious creature to them. But there was no kind of understanding that artist practices are also rooted in research, and it's sort of rigorous and defendable. And once we were able to kind of showcase that to them, and I think at the same time sort of also show how these lawyers work day to day, there was a real kind of like breakdown of separation of the disciplines. And now I have to say, since we started this work in 2014, working with artists, that is, every single week, someone at NRDC who is a lawyer or a policy expert, they will reach out to me and they'll say, we're working on this issue. Do you know an artist who could help us? And so that kind of division or fear or belief that artists didn't have a role to play is gone. And I think that's just like such an incredible thing that Jenny and her work has helped us achieve as an organization.
Jenny, maybe, if you don't mind, this maybe is the last point. Can you talk a little bit about this line that, I mean, your work kind of toes this line between, certainly there's a great amount of formal consideration, aesthetic beauty, like in your works, but there's also this other function. And sometimes that can be like, at least in the contemporary art world, like function can be a kind of like, I don't know, uncomfortable thing to assign to an artwork, and anything beyond like kind of like a lofty kind of mental exercise or something like that. But could you talk about the ways in which your work maybe kind of really is active in both of those frames in meaningful ways?
I think I think my work does a lot of things that push against the dominant narratives in contemporary art. It's not only interested sometimes in this like very brute force functionality, let's literally preserve DNA, or I'm really interested also in beauty, which I think is sometimes we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater there with contemporary art. I don't think that art has to be ugly in order to be intelligent or compelling. I'm really interested in playing with scale. So how can we think of like new forms of monumentality, which actually really value the tiny, the intricate, the delicate, which is like actually has some gendered narratives embedded in there, but also is like working against these kind of the dominant narrative of spectacle in capitalism, which also comes into the art world. But I think I'm maybe missing your question a little bit. Do you want to give me one more pointer in the direction you want me to go.
No, I mean, totally. I mean, I was thinking about the Amber Archive. It's like, you know, it functions as a work of art. It's presented in this gallery, in the gallery at the museum, this very, you know, a somewhat dramatic fashion, right? The light table shining up through it, illuminating these like little orbs of amber. I mean, it's very effective as an experience, but then it is also actually literally preserving genetic information and data. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it's in artwork, but it's also not. It's like this other thing, and those things are kind of laid together in interesting ways. And so, like, if you took that out of the gallery and put it, I don't know where else you'd put it, but you put it somewhere else, right? And you experience that in that other context, like it might register as something slightly different, but it would still be equally as important and meaningful within that other context.
Thank you, first of all. I think, yeah, you're right, that I'm actually oftentimes my references are pulling from places like way outside of contemporary art. So in this case, of course, yes, it's an artwork, but really more than that, it's an archive. It pulls on you know, museological strategies. It pulls on the strategies of natural history museums, on strategies from science. You know, my parents are in the sciences and in medicine, and they, you know, the household that I was lucky enough to be raised in, there was like there was no created separation in curiosity. We just were ravenously curious about the world around us, and that wasn't like separated off into different disciplines. So I think that, you know, maybe in some ways that's the central message that we're all talking about, which is this de-siloing of disciplines. You know, that's what you're doing at the museum, Stephen, bringing the research elements at MSU into the museum in these really compelling ways, like in the Seeds and Service exhibition that's across, or Seeds of Resistance, sorry, I always say Seeds of Service, that's an activist group that I've worked with, across the way from my show. That's what Elizabeth is doing, you know, working with culture makers of all stripes in an advocacy organization. And I really think in some ways that's the message of what I want people to take away for the 21st century and dealing with these intersectional crises of racial justice, you know, migration, the climate crisis. Like, we cannot continue to think about the challenges of the 21st century as things that are going to be tackled by any one discipline or one holder of specialized hierarchical knowledge. We really have to be working across disciplines, and we have to really use every tool in our toolbox. And I think that one important role that artists and culture makers can play here is that we can be the ones to model this shakeup, right? Because maybe we have less to lose, and maybe we're a little more comfortable with the sort of fluency. You know, I joke with Elizabeth that I call myself at NRDC the institutional coyote, that like I'm not tied down to a desk. I can sort of like go wherever I want and nip at heels here and there. And so I think that you know, that is what I want to model here, is to think about how to really use every strategy that we have available to tackle the challenges that face us today.
Well said.